The Soviet Dead Hand System, the AI that could end the world, Chapter 1. The fear of the end, the late 1970s were the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear weapons ready to launch within minutes. Each side feared the other might strike first, and in the chaos that followed, there might not even be time to respond. This fear, not of war itself, but of being blinded and silenced before retaliation, led to the creation of one of the most chilling systems ever built, Perimeter, known in the West as the Dead Hand. To understand why the Soviets built such a system, you have to understand the logic of nuclear deterrence at the time. By the late 1970s, U.S. strategy revolved around the concept of a decapitation strike, a precise, overwhelming first attack that could destroy the Soviet command structure before it had a chance to respond. The idea was that if Moscow's leadership was vaporized in the first minutes of war, there would be no one left to order a counterstrike. The Soviets took that threat seriously. Their intelligence services had observed U.S. efforts to develop advanced command and control weapons, cruise missiles, stealth bombers, and the Trident submarine fleet, capable of striking leadership bunkers in minutes. They feared that an American surprise attack could cut off the head of the Soviet system before its missiles ever left their silos. This possibility was more than theoretical. In 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83, simulating the transition from conventional war to nuclear release. To many in the Kremlin, it looked indistinguishable from the real thing. The Soviet Union briefly raised its nuclear forces to alert, genuinely believing a first strike might be imminent. For Moscow, this reinforced an urgent question: what if we lose command? What if in the opening minutes of war, our generals and communication networks are destroyed? Who ensures retaliation? Because deterrence only works if your enemy knows that no matter what happens, you can still strike back. That logic gave birth to Perimeter. The concept was deceptively simple. Build a system that guarantees a retaliatory strike, even if everyone in the chain of command is dead. A system that would ensure that if the Soviet Union was annihilated, it would take its attacker down with it. Work on Perimeter began in the late 1970s under the direction of the Strategic Rocket Forces and a team of engineers from the Leningrad-based design bureau, Yuzhnoye. The project's technical leadership included Colonel Valery Yerenich, a communications specialist and later one of the few insiders to reveal its existence. Its goal was not to make decisions independently, but to preserve communication between surviving command posts and launch crews, even if the main headquarters were destroyed. The system's codename inside the Soviet military was simply Object 700. The West would later call it Dead Hand, a grim metaphor for a lifeless hand pressing the button after civilization itself had ended. But contrary to myths, Perimeter was not a fully autonomous doomsday machine. It was not an artificial intelligence making moral choices. It was a failed deadly communication network designed to transmit launch commands when all else failed. Its strength lay in its ability to function when normal command links, telephones, radios, satellites, were gone. Still, its existence represented a terrifying step. The USSR was building a system that could, in theory, unleash hundreds of nuclear warheads automatically, if certain catastrophic conditions were met. To the men designing it, this was not madness. It was stability through inevitability. If the Americans knew that even a perfect first strike could not prevent retaliation, they would never dare to attack in the first place. In their logic, Perimeter wasn't a path to destruction. It was a machine of peace, a way to guarantee that nuclear deterrence would always hold, no matter what. But deep beneath that logic was a darker reality. The more automated deterrence became, the closer the world came to a situation where human beings were no longer in control of their own survival. And as the project moved from design to deployment, the Soviets began to construct the physical infrastructure that would make the Dead Hand real. Buried command bunkers, sensor networks, and missiles that would transmit launch codes instead of warheads. The system was coming to life. Chapter 2. How Dead Hand worked. Perimeter, known in the West as Dead Hand, was not an artificial intelligence deciding humanity's fate. It was a redundant command and control network, engineered to make sure that even if the Soviet leadership and communication lines were destroyed, a retaliatory nuclear strike could still be launched. Its purpose was grim but rational: to remove the enemy's hope of surviving a first strike unpunished. The system was built around one central idea: if the command structure dies, the order to retaliate must live on. In the sensors, detecting the end of the world perimeter, was designed to recognize the unmistakable signs of a nuclear apocalypse. Its network of instruments looked for several categories of data: seismic sensors to detect the ground shock waves produced by nuclear detonations, radiation detectors measuring sudden increases in gamma and neutron levels over Soviet territory, infrasonic and atmospheric pressure sensors identifying large-scale air bursts or atmospheric disturbances, communication monitors checking the continuity of radio, satellite, and landline contact with the main command posts. The system did not rely on a single source of data. It required multiple concurrent confirmations, for example, simultaneous seismic shocks, spikes in radiation, and a complete loss of communication with the general staff. Only when several catastrophic indicators matched would the system move to the next stage. 2. The architecture: a network that could not be killed. By the late 1970s, Soviet planners realized that their main command posts were vulnerable to U.S. precision strikes. To solve this, Perimeter used a chain of underground bunkers, hardened communication nodes, and radio relays designed to survive nuclear impact. At its core was a unique Soviet invention: the command missile. Instead of carrying a nuclear warhead, this missile was equipped with a powerful radio transmitter. Once launched, it would fly over Soviet territory, broadcasting launch authorization codes to all remaining nuclear units, silos, mobile launchers, submarines, that were still operational. In essence, the command missile was a flying radio tower, ensuring that even if every cable, antenna, and satellite was gone, the order to retaliate would still reach the field forces. This innovation made Perimeter a fail-deadly system, meaning that if all else failed, destruction would still follow automatically. 3. Human control and the semi-automatic nature. Despite the myths, Perimeter was never fully autonomous. It could not independently decide to start a nuclear war. It was semi-automatic, capable of carrying out retaliation only after certain preconditions and human actions had been met. Here's how it actually worked. In a crisis, the Soviet leadership could pre-arm Perimeter, switching it to standby mode. Once activated, the system would begin monitoring its sensor network. If nuclear detonations were detected and communications with the general staff were lost, the system would initiate a confirmation sequence. Inside fortified bunkers, human officers, known as perimeter duty crews, were stationed to verify the data. If they confirmed that the country's command structure was indeed destroyed and no cancellation code was received, the officers could authorize the command missile to launch. The presence of these human operators was the key safeguard. They ensured that the final signal to launch could not be sent without human validation. The Soviets, even at their most paranoid, did not trust machines to make the ultimate decision. 4. The command chain in action if triggered. The command missile, often associated with modified UR-100 UTTKH ICBMs, would be fired from one of several hardened silos. As it soared over the Soviet Union, it continuously transmitted encrypted signals to launch control centers and missile units still capable of firing. Those signals were standard, pre-authenticated launch codes, the same ones used by the general staff in normal wartime conditions. In effect, Perimeter duplicated the human command chain through automated radio broadcast. This mechanism ensured that even if the Kremlin, Moscow's bunkers, and the Strategic Rocket Force's main headquarters were obliterated, isolated crews could still carry out the retaliatory launch sequence. 5. What it was and what it wasn't. Perimeter was a communication backup, not a thinking doomsday machine. It didn't choose targets or calculate strategy. It simply ensured that launch orders, once authorized, could reach every surviving launcher. Its purpose was deterrence, to convince the US that even a perfect surprise attack would not prevent Soviet retaliation. By guaranteeing mutual destruction under any scenario, it restored strategic stability in the eyes of its creators. But the design also introduced a new danger: Even though the system was heavily guarded by manual checkpoints, it relied on sensors and communications that could, in theory, malfunction. A massive earthquake, a radiation leak, or a coincidental communication failure could mimic the signs of a nuclear strike. Theoretically, such a chain of coincidences could trigger a false alarm, though experts agree the multiple redundancy layers made this extremely unlikely. 6. A machine for peace. Through terror. To Western observers, the idea of a machine that could launch nuclear war after its operators were dead sounded like madness. To Soviet strategists, it was the purest form of deterrence. If your enemy knows that even his most perfect strike guarantees his own destruction, then war becomes impossible to start. This was the paradox at the heart of Perimeter, a system built not to destroy the world, but to ensure that no one would ever dare to try. Chapter 3. Inside the system, the human factor. For all its machinery, the heart of Perimeter was still human. It wasn't a computer deciding the fate of nations. It was a group of trained officers sitting deep underground, surrounded by screens, switches, and silence, waiting for signs that the world above had ended. These men were known as the Perimeter Duty Crews, small elite teams drawn from the strategic rocket forces. They were stationed in reinforced bunkers hundreds of meters below ground, in facilities designed to withstand direct nuclear hits. Each bunker contained its own communication lines, life support systems, and control consoles connected to the network of sensors and command missiles that made up the system. To outsiders, they were ghosts, invisible soldiers assigned to a mission they hoped would never activate. 1. The bunkers beneath the Earth. The exact locations of the Perimeter command posts remain classified, but open-source intelligence and Russian press leaks suggest that several were built in the late 1970s across the Soviet Union's strategic heartland. One of them, later associated with the Kozvinsky-Kamenny mountain complex in the Urals, is believed to have hosted upgraded versions of the system in the 1990s. These sites were chosen for one reason: survivability. Each facility was buried deep enough to resist megaton-level blasts and equipped with air filtration, food stores, and power for weeks of isolation. They were sealed worlds, designed for the unthinkable, to continue operating after the rest of the command structure was gone. Inside, the environment was sterile and cold. Walls lined with thick cables, radiation monitors glowing faintly, and heavy steel blast doors separating each control section. Operators worked in rotation, following a rigid schedule of tests and readiness checks, verifying sensors, encryption codes, and communication links. Their job was to be the last conscious link in a chain of retaliation. 2. The protocol of the end. The Perimeter system could not simply start itself. For it to function, it first had to be manually armed by the General Staff or the Strategic Rocket Forces Command. Only during a crisis, when the leadership believed that a nuclear strike was likely, would the system be switched to active standby. Once armed, a timer and verification loop would begin. The crew's first responsibility was to monitor the network, seismic activity, radiation, communication status, and reports from missile divisions. They would compare automated readings with external confirmation when possible. If all communication with Moscow ceased, and if the sensors indicated nuclear detonations across Soviet territory, the protocol would advance to the silence verification phase, a set period believed to be between 15 and 30 minutes, during which operators would wait for any last incoming message or cancel code from surviving authorities. If none arrived, the crew would face the decision for which they had been trained but never wanted to make, to authorize the command missile launch. That action would not directly fire nuclear weapons. Instead, it would trigger the special communication missile, broadcasting launch codes to all surviving missile units. The officers knew what it meant. Their action would unleash the remaining arsenal of the Soviet Union. 3. The weight of the decision. The men assigned to Perimeter were carefully selected. They were not mere technicians. They were military officers with top-level psychological screening and decades of service. They were taught discipline, but also skepticism, to question anomalies, to double-check before confirming a world-ending signal. Training records declassified after the fall of the USSR show that crews repeatedly simulated partial loss of communications, radiation spikes, and false sensor data to practice distinguishing between true and false alerts. The system's designers, including Colonel Valery Yarenich, insisted that human verification was indispensable. Yarenich would later recall in interviews that Perimeter was deliberately designed to require human judgment at every step. The system was only a backup, he said. There was always a person at the end of the chain. Still, the psychological pressure was immense. Sitting in a silent bunker, cut off from the surface, surrounded by indicators of catastrophe, tremors, radiation alarms, static-filled radio bands, the operators might never know for certain if the world above still existed. They were trained to trust the system more than their own instincts, but the responsibility was unbearable. 4. The human logic behind the machine. To Western analysts, the idea of such a system looked like madness. Why give machines the power to start Armageddon? But to Soviet commanders, the human factor was exactly what made Perimeter rational. They saw it not as surrendering control to automation, but as protecting human control against the chaos of war. In their view, a decapitation strike, killing the leadership, was the ultimate form of dehumanization. Perimeter was their answer. Even if the generals and politicians were gone, a few surviving officers, deep underground, could still speak for the country. It was not faith in technology, it was faith in duty. 5. A day in the bunker. A typical day for a Perimeter crew followed strict routine. Wake at 600. System checks. Communication link tests. Meal rotations. Emergency drills. The shifts were monotonous, but every action was logged and repeated with military precision. Every operator knew what would happen if the final order came. The key switch would be turned, coded signals transmitted, and within minutes the command missile would launch. They would likely die soon after, either trapped underground or from the consequences of global nuclear war. Their existence was both meaningless and essential, to ensure that no enemy could ever destroy the power to retaliate. 6. The paradox of humanity in a machine. In the end, Perimeter's human operators embodied the paradox of the Cold War itself. Men building machines to preserve humanity by threatening to destroy it. They were the last line of the Soviet command chain, yet they were also its conscience. The system around them was cold, logical, and unfeeling, but the men inside it lived with the unbearable burden of knowing that their actions, or their silence, could end civilization. As Colonel Yarenich later said, the system existed so that no one would ever dare to test it. Chapter 4. The Logic of Apocalypse. At first glance, Perimeter seems like insanity made metal, a machine built to start a nuclear war even when no one is left alive to order it. But to understand why the Soviet Union created it, you have to step inside the Cold War mindset, a world where survival depended not on reason, but on certainty. The logic of deterrence was brutally simple. Each side needed to convince the other that it could and would retaliate no matter what. The moment one superpower believed it could strike first and destroy the other's command system before retaliation, the balance collapsed. In the late 1970s, the Soviet leadership began to fear exactly that. 1. The decapitation threat. By the mid-1970s, U.S. strategy had shifted from massive retaliation to counter-force targeting, the idea of striking the enemy's nuclear forces and leadership before they could respond. New American technologies, Minuteman III ICBMs with MIRV warheads, stealth bombers under development, and accurate submarine-launched missiles, all suggested that Washington might soon be capable of a disarming first strike. In Soviet eyes, this was not theoretical. Intelligence reports suggested that the U.S. was developing plans to blind and behead the Soviet command network. The goal would not be to destroy cities, but to decimate command centers, silos, and communication nodes, leaving Moscow unable to respond. For Soviet planners, that possibility was intolerable. A deterrent that could be destroyed wasn't a deterrent, it was an invitation. Thus emerged the core idea of Perimeter. Even if the leadership is annihilated, retaliation must still be certain. 2. Fail deadly versus fail safe. To understand Perimeter's philosophy, it helps to contrast it with the American approach. U.S. command systems were built on a fail-safe principle, meaning that in case of uncertainty, the system fails by not launching. Human intervention was always required to confirm and authorize a nuclear strike. Perimeter was built on the opposite concept, fail deadly. In other words, if the worst happened, if the Soviet Union was already under nuclear fire and all command was gone, the system would ensure that destruction still came to the aggressor. It was not designed to prevent nuclear war, but to prevent the possibility of victory in one. This philosophical difference reflected the psychology of the two superpowers. The US feared accidental war. The USSR feared decapitation. For Moscow, not launching after destruction was the ultimate defeat. 3. Strategic stability through terror. Perimeter was built to restore what strategists called stability under extreme conditions. By guaranteeing retaliation even in the event of national annihilation, it removed the incentive for a U.S. first strike. If America knew that even the destruction of Moscow and the general staff would still result in its own annihilation, it would never attempt such a strike. To Soviet leaders like Marshal Ogarkov and Defense Minister Ustinov, this was not madness, it was math. A fully automated backup command chain reduced the risk of mistaken restraint, the possibility that fear, indecision, or confusion might stop a justified retaliation. Ironically, the dead hand was built to prevent nuclear war, not to cause it. In its designer's view, the certainty of mutual destruction kept both sides frozen in a paradoxical peace. 4. The political logic of fear. The 1980s were a period of deep paranoia in the Kremlin. U.S. President Ronald Reagan had launched an arms buildup, including the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe that could reach Moscow in less than 10 minutes. Reagan's Evil Empire speech and the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars project, convinced Soviet hardliners that Washington might actually believe it could win a nuclear war. Perimeter was the Soviet answer to that fantasy. It said, in effect, even if you win on paper, you lose in reality. No matter how fast or how accurate your missiles are, the moment they fall, a silent machine deep underground will guarantee your destruction. That idea had an immense psychological effect. Even U.S. intelligence analysts, when they discovered hints of the system in the 1980s, concluded that it made a decapitation strike pointless. The CIA's reports called it a stabilizing but dangerous safeguard. Stabilizing because it prevented rash first strikes, dangerous because it introduced one more layer of uncertainty into an already fragile balance. 5. The dangers of perfect deterrence. Yet even as Perimeter reinforced deterrence, it made the global nuclear system more complex and potentially more fragile. Every new layer of automation created new possibilities for misunderstanding. Imagine a scenario. A massive solar storm or earthquake triggers seismic sensors. Communications are disrupted by atmospheric interference. In peacetime, nothing would happen. Humans would recognize the anomalies. But in a high-tension crisis, when both sides expected the other to strike first, such coincidences could look terrifyingly real. That was the ultimate danger of Perimeter. Not that it would start a war on its own, but that it made the line between war and peace thinner than ever. The system's strength, its automatic certainty, was also its greatest risk. 6. The cold rationality of the machine. In the end, Perimeter was a perfect reflection of Cold War logic, a system so rational it bordered on insanity. It made nuclear war unwinnable, and thus, in theory, unthinkable. But it also forced humanity to live permanently on the edge of annihilation. To Soviet commanders, this was balance. To everyone else, it was madness disguised as logic. Yet for decades, that logic held. The system was built, tested, and, according to Russian officials, still quietly maintained in some form today. A machine that exists so that it will never have to act. A weapon that guarantees peace by being ready to end everything. Chapter 5, Revelation and Legacy. For more than a decade, Perimeter remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Soviet military. Even after the Cold War ended, few outside the highest ranks of the strategic rocket forces knew that such a system existed. It wasn't until the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union itself collapsed, that the world learned the truth. The revelation came not from a spy or a defector, but from one of the men who had helped design it, Colonel Valery E. Yarenich, a communications engineer and nuclear strategist. In 1993, Yarenich publicly described Perimeter for the first time in interviews and technical papers, confirming what Western analysts had only suspected, that the Soviet Union had indeed built an automated nuclear command system designed to guarantee retaliation after a decapitating strike. To most of the world, it sounded like science fiction. But to those who understood Cold War logic, it made perfect sense. 1. The official acknowledgement. For years, Russian officials avoided commenting on Yarenich's claims. Then, in 2009, General Viktor Yasin, former chief of staff of the Strategic Rocket Forces, publicly acknowledged the system's existence in an interview with Komsomolskaya Pravda. Yasin confirmed that Perimeter had been operational during the late Cold War, and that a modernized version still existed as part of Russia's current nuclear command structure. His words shocked Western observers. While the details remain classified, his statement implied that the logic of the dead hand had not died with the Soviet Union. The system, he said, had been upgraded and maintained in full readiness. In other words, the world's most fearsome safeguard, a machine that exists only to launch when all humans are gone, still watches quietly in the background. 2. A legacy of fear and stability. Historians and strategists still debate whether Perimeter made the world safer or more dangerous. On one hand, it achieved what it was designed for. It stabilized deterrence. Knowing that any nuclear attack on Russia would still trigger an inevitable counterstrike, no rational actor could ever believe in a winnable nuclear war. On the other hand, it entrenched a terrifying principle that peace depended not on diplomacy or restraint, but on machines that would destroy everything automatically if humans failed. In the years since the Cold War, Russian officials have described Perimeter not as a doomsday device, but as an emergency communication network. In theory, its function today is to ensure that the order for retaliation can always be transmitted, even under extreme circumstances. Still, the system's existence means that the final safeguard of humanity rests partly on technology built nearly half a century ago, hardware and protocols designed for a different era, but still trusted to prevent catastrophe. 3. The Western reaction. When the story of Perimeter became known in the 1990s, many in the West reacted with disbelief. Was it truly possible that the Soviet Union had built a machine that could launch nuclear war automatically? U.S. intelligence agencies eventually confirmed parts of Yarenich's account, noting that they had long suspected such a backup network existed, though its scope was unclear. For nuclear strategists, Perimeter became a case study in what was called deterrence automation, the point at which humans build systems so secure, so redundant, that they almost remove themselves from the equation. It was the physical manifestation of a paradox. The more you try to prevent war, the more you risk making it inevitable. The moral question. The existence of Perimeter also forced the world to confront an unsettling question. How much control should humanity surrender to machines in the name of security? In the decades since, this question has only grown more relevant. Today's nuclear command systems rely on digital networks, artificial intelligence support tools, and satellite sensors. The line between human judgment and algorithmic reaction is thinner than ever. Yarenich himself spent his later years warning against this very danger. He argued that while Perimeter had been a rational safeguard in a bipolar world, new technologies could make decision times so short that the next generation of automated deterrence might truly remove humans from the loop. The goal, he wrote, must always be to keep a human finger on the button and off the trigger. 5. A machine that keeps the peace. No one outside Russia's top military command knows the exact status of Perimeter today. Some analysts believe it has been deactivated. Others claim it remains in silent readiness, updated with modern communication systems. Officially, the Russian government describes it as maintained as a component of strategic stability. What's certain is that its existence continues to influence global strategy. The knowledge that a nuclear strike could still trigger an automatic counterstrike, even if leaders are dead, reinforces the doctrine of mutually assured destruction that still underpins nuclear deterrence today. In that sense, Dead Hand succeeded in its grim purpose. It kept the world in check, not through diplomacy or morality, but through the cold certainty of annihilation. 6. The shadow that remains. Nearly half a century after its creation, Perimeter endures as a symbol of both human genius and human fear. It represents the peak of Cold War logic, a system so rational that it became terrifying. A network designed not to start wars, but to ensure that once one began, there would be no survivors to claim victory. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: it still might be active. Somewhere deep beneath Russian soil, there may still be a bunker with a handful of officers watching silent monitors, ready to act if the world above ever disappears into light. A system that lives so that humanity never has to die by it. A machine that guarantees peace by being ready to end the world. This was the story of the Soviet Dead Hand system, the AI that could end the world, a weapon born from fear, designed for stability, and built to make sure that even the end would not come quietly. If you're fascinated by Cold War secrets, nuclear strategy, and the technology that still shapes our survival, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories from the hidden side of history.